Hi everyone, my name is Samantha Hill and I am the Assistant Director of the Hannah Arendt Center. Welcome to the virtual reading group. I'm going to be leading us through our next three sessions, and we're going to be starting off with Hannah Arendt's essay, We Refugees. So I'm just going to start by saying a couple of words about the context of the essay. This is actually one of my favorite essays of Hannah Arendt's. It's published in the beautifully edited volume by Jerome Kohn, The Jewish Writings, which is the copy that you have as a PDF. That essay is very uncharacteristic for Hannah Arendt. It's one of the rare examples we have of her speaking from a personal perspective, reflecting on what it means to be a Jewish person during the Holocaust, an immigrant and a refugee. It's also just one of the rare instances in which she reflects upon her Jewish identity. So the essay was originally written in 1943, 2 years after she emigrated to the United States, for a small Jewish journal, Menorah. The essay has largely been ignored by Arendtian scholarship until recent years. A couple of mentions here and there. Giorgio Agamben, if you're interested, has a well-known essay with the same title that he wrote in response to Arendt's. But the essay touches upon several themes that recur throughout Arendt's writing. It was written before Origins of Totalitarianism and the Human Condition, but as we'll see in this essay, she touches upon a lot of the major themes that are going to emerge in her later writings, where she tries to offer an understanding of the phenomenal appearance of totalitarianism in the 20th century. So this essay is going to dig into the relationship between loss and politics, thinking about hope and despair, optimism, what it means to be a person and appear in the world and have meaning, and what happens when the distinction between public, social, and private collapses, forcing us to turn back upon ourselves. And she's going to draw out a distinction that's really important between parvenus and pariahs, thinking about how it is individuals can find meaning in the world when the world turns them away. So let's start at the beginning of the essay. So Arendt starts by saying, in the first place, we don't like to be called refugees. I just want to pause there for a second. So one of the things that gets Arendt in trouble is her use of irony and her use of sarcasm. One thing to keep in mind as you're reading this essay, and I suggest everyone read it more than once, it's not that long and there's a lot of different elements at play, is that this essay is deeply ironic, right? She is going to be using irony as a rhetorical device in order to illustrate how absurd the idea that we should just forget about it and be optimistic and move on is when one is facing something as horrific and unthinkable as the Holocaust, under the conditions of loss that were caused by authoritarianism and totalitarianism in the 20th century. So in the first place, we don't like to be called refugees. And she goes on to explain that historically, the term refugee has been applied to people who were forced to flee due to political persecution or because of some crime they had committed. And so those who were driven from Hitler's Reich merely because of their Jewish identity preferred to be called newcomers or immigrants because they had not committed any crimes. Right? And she notes that Jewish people were even more sensitive to being called refugees before the war because they wanted to be perceived as having left on their own accord to start over or rebuild their lives She says, in order to rebuild one's life, one has to be strong and an optimist. Right. So Arendt's essay unfolds as she reflects upon the condition of Jewish refugees and the number of suicides that occurred during and after the war. And Arendt quickly reveals how the optimism that was necessary to rebuild one's life was created in the face of loss. And her disdain for this kind of vain optimism reminds us as readers that it's really an expression of despair, which is wrought from the many material and worldly losses that people suffered. So she goes on to say, our optimism is indeed admirable, even if we say so ourselves. The story of our struggle has finally become known. We lost our home, which means the familiarity of daily life. We lost our occupation, which means the confidence that we are of some use in this world. We lost our language, which means the naturalness of reactions, the simplicity of gestures, the unaffected expression of feelings. We left our relatives in the Polish ghettos, and our best friends have been killed in concentration camps. And that means the rupture of our private lives. Arendt's list of losses and reaches past the components of daily life and into the core of human identity, what makes life livable in this world. Right? A sense of familiarity that allows us to move freely, an occupation that gives day-to-day life meaning, language that threads tradition and heritage together, human lives, lost, friends, family. The things that we acquire, all of these crucial elements of identity, were completely stripped away. And with the physical disappearance of so much came the loss of meaning, right? Which for Arendt, as we know, is going to equate to the loss of the world. Throughout the essay, Arendt expresses frustration with the idea that Jewish people were somehow, in the face of this catastrophe, supposed to be optimistic, supposed to be able to move on and turn away from what was happening. And the ironic use of optimistic language that she begins with quickly becomes a reflection of the despair of the Jewish people and a recognition that the optimism was a kind of superficial attempt to overcome the losses. The need to forget and become optimistic becomes one and the same for the Jewish people who were forced to immigrate. And so reflecting on this desperate optimism, Arendt emphasizes that such forgetting is not possible. She says, no, there's something wrong with our optimism. There are those odd optimists among us who, having made a lot of optimistic speeches, go home and turn on the gas or make use of a skyscraper in a quite unexpected way. So from this passage, which is rather stark, we can see how Arendt drew a line between the public need to appear optimistic and the inability to be so in private. The private quality of such losses cannot be forced to appear differently in public, giving speeches, talking with others. And even though they were told not to talk about what was happening, they knew the truth. And when they couldn't bear it any longer, the optimism gave way to a kind of hopelessness. And she writes, quote, their optimism is the vain attempt to keep head above water. Behind this kind of cheerfulness, they constantly struggle with despair themselves. Finally, they die of a kind of selfishness. The attempt to forget, to not mention such events, to adopt a new home, to not be Jews, was in vain. Right? It was the denial of their lives and their selves, of what was left after all had been taken, that led them to reject the world by taking their own lives. And in this sense, it's easy to see why Arendt takes such a hardline view of optimism, but also how the losses that occurred shaped her understanding of what it meant to live in a world where all boundaries between public and private life had been destroyed. With the collapse of the social realm, individuals could no longer appear in public as they once had. The simplest act of buying bread became a reflection of their rejection from the world. Arendt writes, we tried the best we can to fit into a world where you have to be sort of politically minded when you buy your food. They were no longer welcome where they had once been at home. Beginning from this place of loss, Arendt then moves into thinking about the different ways in which individuals dealt with what was happening. So she's going to turn away from suicide, although acknowledging it, as a response to the Holocaust, and offer us a juxtaposition between pariahs and parvenus, right? So the collapse of the social sphere pushed individuals into extreme states of hope and despair. And she's going to, if you're curious and you want to go back to the preface of Origins, she's going to echo this language there. For Arendt, hope and despair are intimately bound to the loss of oneself and the conditions that make life livable in this world, that make us feel at home. For Arendt, the turn to what she calls blind optimism constitutes the same dangerous turn away from the present moment. The denial of loss of the experiences of our existence affect the way that we interact with the world and one another. She says, the less we are free to decide who we are or to live as we like, the more we try to put up a front, to hide the facts, to play roles, right? If we are told to forget, then we are in essence denying a part of ourselves and forced to live a factitious existence. Right? So for Arendt, to deny one's past and not come to a critical understanding of the world is tantamount to denying the human condition and turning away from humanity. When she's talking about putting on a front, she offers us the example of parvenus, and to illustrate the severity of this personality type and the mentality that the Jewish people were encouraged to accept, Arendt offers us the story of Mr. Kohn. So Mr. Kohn was from Berlin, where he claimed to have, quote, always been 150% German. In 1933, that Mr. Kohn found refuge in Prague and very quickly became a convinced Czech patriot, as true and as loyal as Czech patriot as he had been a German one. So when Mr. Kohn was forced to leave Prague under Nazi pressure in 1933, he found a new home in Vienna, where he became an Austrian super patriot. And on, Mr. Kohn became the best citizen wherever he was forced to emigrate to. And Arendt ends her anecdote with the addendum that, quote, as long as Mr. Kohn can't make up his mind as long as Mr. Kohn can't make up his mind to be what he actually is, a Jew, nobody can foretell all the mad changes he will still have to go through. Mr. Kohn suffers from what Arendt calls, this is a beautiful quote, the desperate confusion of these Ulysses wanderers, who are unable to admit to themselves their true identities. So in Arendt's rejection of the parvenu's optimism to start over, right, of the Mr. Kohn personality who tries to forget who he was in order to make it in the world, she praises the pariah who chooses to take his or her identity and carry it through the world. Right? The pariah's refusal to forget is a way of acknowledging the losses that have shaped their identity as Jewish people. Arendt writes, quote, a man who wants to lose his self discovers indeed the possibilities of human existence, which are infinite as creation, but the recovering of a new personality is as difficult and as hopeless as a new creation of the world. Our only option is to be who we are, and if we try to reject that essential fact of our existence, which is what cannot be taken away from us, then in a way we're rejecting the world that we've been born into, right? And so Arendt recognizes the limitless possibilities of human existence as the constant and ever-renewing potential to begin again. And when a person tries to willfully lose himself, though, and become someone else, it's completely hopeless. In an attempt to cast off their past, to forget the experiences that they want to leave behind, but such forgetting is not possible. Right? And so Arendt's reflection on the desire to start over also reveals the desperate relationship between hope and despair. right? And it illustrates how hope becomes this kind of superficial attempt at becoming and appearing someone else in the world instead of reckoning and coming face to face with who we are. And loss might create the possibility to begin anew, but contained within this possibility is the knowledge that we'll never be able to assimilate or regain our former self. The opportunity to start over, in another sense, is forced. Right? And this experience of loss is constituted by an extreme deprivation of familiar life. Right? For Arendt, the condition of the Jewish people has always been one of constant homelessness. And she begins "We refugees." She reiterates the stateless as she begins "We refugees." She reiterates the statelessness or loss of one's homeland. And this loss of one's home is not only central to her understanding of the Jewish question, but it reveals how fundamental a home for people, not necessarily a people, is to the human condition. The experience of this new kind of home, right, a loss that comes about through the denial of one's very self, permeates her writing. This lesson extends beyond the displacement of European Jewish peoples. Under the right conditions, any or all of us may be subjected to a similar experience of loss. And so when she begins the essay with "We lost our home" and moves to the broader losses of language, community, and country of origin, not having a proper place, somewhere to call home, the Jewish people were doubly cast out from both their private lives and their homelands. And Arendt writes, quote, "The Jews have been wandering around the world for 2,000 years, taking in tow their belongings, their children, their nostalgia for a homeland. Without any specific place to call home, the entire world becomes a shelter, and life is not defined in terms of allegiance to some place, but rather becomes life in and of itself." So, moving toward the end of the essay, Arendt says on page 273, "If we should start telling the truth that we are nothing but Jews, it would mean that we expose ourselves to the fate of human beings who, unprotected by any specific law or political convention, are nothing but human beings. I can hardly imagine an attitude more dangerous, since we actually live in a world in which human beings as such have ceased to exist for quite a while, since society has discovered discrimination as the great social weapon by which one may kill men without any bloodshed, since passports or birth certificates and sometimes even income tax receipts are no longer formal papers but matters of social distinction." And so here in these lines, she's reflecting upon the pervasive meaninglessness that has affected the social and political structures of the modern world, and how society, right, the social, comes to dominate and eradicate any meaningful difference that might exist for individuals as human beings. So in the final paragraph, Arendt is returning to the distinction between pariahs and parvenus, and she says, "History has forced the status of outlaws upon both, upon pariahs and parvenus alike. The latter have not yet accepted the great wisdom of Balzac's 'We did not come at all.' Thus they don't understand the wild dreams of the former and feel humiliated in sharing their fate. Those few refugees who insist upon telling the truth, even to the point of indecency, get in exchange for their unpopularity one priceless advantage. History is no longer a closed book to them, and politics is no longer the privilege of Gentiles. Refugees driven from country to country represent the vanguard of their peoples, if they keep their identity." Right? And this is a very powerful political argument that Arendt is making under the most extreme conditions of loss, that even if a people doesn't have a home if they are if the elements of everyday life which give meaning are stripped away, those elements that she listed out at the beginning of the essay, they still have their identity as a people that they can hold on to and can refuse to assimilate, to become something that they are not. And as long as they hold on to that as a form of truth, I think, then one does not need the rhetoric of optimism or despair. And so you can see how in recent years this essay has been picked up by a number of scholars who are writing on the current refugee crisis that we're facing today in our contemporary world, and which I hope we can talk more about on Friday. I'm going to stop there. I hope that's giving you a couple of touchstones to look for as you make your way through the essay. I'm looking forward to our discussion. Have a good week.